You are listening to the Necropolis podcast, which is brought to you by Jason from Goatcraft and Shelly from HateMeditations.com and Metal Legion magazine. Welcome back to Necropolis. We're doing another tier list, 1992 death metal ranked. So I went through Metal Archives, did a filter, and I got the 20 full links, or the 30 full links, I should say, of what I view as most noteworthy from 1992. And as you can see on your screen here, if you're watching on YouTube, there are a lot of fucking fantastic albums from 1992. Really excited to talk about some of these albums. They're very influential in my listenership of extreme metal. And there's some that they're certainly timeless classics in here. Some that I may not be that fond of, but they are, bigger names in the mainstream consciousness. So I figure we'll talk about that quite a bit. Today it will just be Shelly and I, and we're going to attempt to blitz through all 30 albums today. So Shelly, I want to thank you and your rigor today. We're about to get into it pretty hard.
It's what I do. It's fine. A lot of great albums on the list, but also looks like there's some curveballs in here that will be interesting to see where we sit on them, because there's some that I just think are a bit oddball, but we'll get into that, I'm sure. But yeah, excited to discuss some death metal.
Yes, sir. Me too. All right. Since we only have 2 hours and we have 30 albums to get through, I'm going to go ahead and rank. So first up is that Incantation, Onward to Golgotha. Definitely an S tier for me, and I do want to thank Shelly for being the driver today on that Canva. He is zipping along there, moving the albums quickly, as we can see in front of our eyes here. Onward to Golgotha is the ultimate Incantation album. I have said in the past, I'm sure if I said it on this podcast, but I might have said it on other podcasts and interviews, that Onward to Golgotha is the archetype, like the platonic form of death metal. If an album has elements that is presented on Onward to Golgotha, it is empirically death metal, and it is also in spirit. It has the numinal side of death metal at its core. And the way the riffs flow, they're super narrative and they're abstract, and it's just, there's no bad song on this album. It's definitely a timeless classic for me. I believe this is the peak for Incantation, honestly, where Diabolical Conquest and some other albums had some, really great moments, but none that was just like the total experience as Onward to Golgotha. So definitely a timeless classic for me. I've listened to it a billion times. And Incantation is one of those bands that I got into really young. I was about 15, and this album has definitely stood the test of time for me. Go ahead, Shelly.
Yeah, we'll follow that. It definitely gets across the sheer monstrosity and malevolence of death metal, alongside the more sophisticated aspects, like that, as you mentioned, like it gets the narrative structure down. The doomy passages work really well alongside the faster passages. It's kind of, Death Doom wasn't really, it existed at this point, obviously, but it wasn't necessarily referred to as Death Doom. It's just like death metal with doomy elements. But because this album has been copied so much, not least by Incantation themselves, that you forget that this album was pretty, what's the word? It was pretty groundbreaking at the time. It wasn't so far left field as far as death metal is concerned. It didn't have any of the progressive elements or anything like that. But it just, as you said, it kind of solidified all of the facets of death metal that we know and love. And the ironic thing about Incantation themselves is, you mentioned Diabolical Conquest, which is the other album that people reach for as like when they almost attained a similar peak. But that's the album where they weren't trying to remake Onward to Golgotha. They were trying to do something a little bit different and almost avant-garde in places, and it really worked for them. But it always feels like for every other Incantation album, they're just trying to recapture this magic and they never can quite manage it. It's a testament to its kind of longevity. And these days, in terms of the contemporary picture of death metal, the amount of bands I come across that are trying to copy this sound or borrow from it liberally or straight up plagiarize it is remarkable. It's become retroactively one of the most influential death metal albums as well. But it can't be topped. So yeah, absolutely S tier.
Yeah, it's up there, and I would actually put it alongside like Blister is Sick, and just like how firm of a statement it was for extreme metal. Strong S tier. And one of those things that's often mimicked, but never, not even Incantation themselves have reached that peak. But really, really phenomenal album. Can't say enough good things about it. John McEntee, he was a freaking genius on this album, creating those riffs, and I think Craig Pillard was on vocals, and just the
Yeah.
whole aesthetic of it was phenomenal. But yeah, next up is that Deicide Legion, arguably another one of the best death metal albums of all time. So Deicide Legion was the follow-up to just Deicide. I've heard some people say that their favorite is the self-titled album, but this is just I view it as a fluke of nature. It's the most assaulting death metal. It's just right in your face. It does not relent at all. It's pretty short too. I believe it's around like 28 minutes long, and uh it's one of those albums that it just manifests in this ultimate violent form of death metal, and it's just hard. Like Deicide, like they had some ounces of the aggression on Once Upon a Cross after this, but nothing close to the sheer terror that is Deicide Legion. And it's another this I compare Samath Godless Arrogance as like the black metal version of Deicide Legion. Is for good reason too, because it's just unrelenting, and it's relentless, and it's just comes, and it just goes as fast as it comes. It's already gone, and it's just like, whoa, that was fucking amazing. And there are like narrative, structures in this album as well, but it's more compact. It's more about the violence of death metal. And a lot of bands have tried to capture Deicide Legion, but none of them have come close to it at all. So what are your thoughts on that, Shelley?
Yeah, so the self-titled debut is kind of a strange album in that it tries to like reach that level of just blind occultist fury. But it almost, in places, for such a sort of extreme and assaulting album, it comes across as almost catchy and anthemic in places. And it's clear that Deicide are still trying to find their voice a little bit. And they're one of these bands where the step up from that to this is kind of, as you mentioned, a fluke of nature. It's kind of beyond belief that it was the same band almost. And yeah, it's another one where, yeah, Deicide have never really done anything like this since. And I don't think any death metal band has done anything like this since. Um, I don't want to be Mr. Hot Take. I've got a weird opinion on this album, but I do compare it to Atheist's Unquestionable Presence quite a lot. Obviously not, stylistically or sonically or anything. They were both doing very different things, but it's rare to see a band so like lockstep with each other, so like tight and kind of what's the word, working in unison to such a degree. Just the barrage of noise that comes at you, it isn't just like a grindcore album that just flows past in a stream of static and blast beats. Like there's intentionality here. There's like mechanical complexity to the rhythm. Like what you think is just like a basic backbeat will quickly shuffle around, and then the beat kind of goes a little bit off center, but the guitars and the bass are just locked in the pocket with it every time. And then you've got Glenn Benton's just iconic vocal performance on this album, where obviously
He
you've got the
raps.
gutter.
Yeah, he raps in one
He
part.
does rap, yeah. But yeah, because obviously the album Legion, it's based on the biblical tale of the guy that was possessed by many demons. My name is Legion, for we are many. But Glenn Benton's vocal performance tries to get that across as well by having the guttural range, the mid, and then these really maniacal high pitched screeches and sort of all overdubbed with each other. But the way he kind of works that around the complexity of the rhythms, and yeah, sometimes it comes across as rap because he matches like the chugging blast beat with each syllable. And again, I mean, Benton's he's an eccentric guy anyway. And the other thing I love about this album is not just the fact that he goes hell for leather with that performance, but this was at a time when black metal was starting to make inroads into death metal as like the extreme quote unquote genre, and some death metal bands were being accused of wearing, cargo shorts and tracksuits and not really taking it seriously. And Chuck of Death was already being like, oh no, it's all make believe, and I prefer to talk about societal issues. Glenn Benson's just like, no, I'm a Satanist. I'm branding a inverted crucifix on my forehead. It's all totally for real. Like him and Morbid Angel, you could tell there was a bit more commitment and conviction, which kind of just gives it that edge over some other death metal from the time.
Yeah, that was back when he was doing the Bob Larson interviews with the
Yeah,
evangelical guy. He does exorcisms now. It was a fake exorcisms guy, but yeah, he's making that money. But yeah, phenomenal album. I concur with everything that you said, other than perhaps the atheist correlation. I
no,
but
that's just my weird take.
yeah, phenomenal album. Can't say enough great things about it. It's one of those things that I don't listen to it often, but when I do listen to it, it just smacks me in the face. It's just sheer like sonic assault right on my senses, and wonderful, wonderful album. So next up is Therion Beyond Sanctorum. So my first, I had heard this when I was a kid, but I didn't really connect with it as much until after I finished basic training when I was in the military. I was in tech school and I didn't have any music. So I'm my friend or former friend, I don't know, we haven't talked in years, Josh Wheeler from the band Blood Obsession. He was also the upstate New York president of the New York Death Militia that Will Brommer from Mortician runs. Anyway, he had sent me a lot of CDRs when I was in tech school, so I could have some metal to listen to. And eventually, I got a laptop and I just streamed everything. But there were some nights where I would just get through tech school stuff. In the morning, would work out vigorously and attend classes, and I learned all about missiles and bombs and all that. And it was very, very fast paced. Like technical training in the Air Force is a lot. I took accelerated courses in college, and Air Force Tech School was even faster than that with how much we had to learn. And we couldn't get below a B in our training too. So it was one of those things where I was exhausted, and my only reprieve from my waking life was, those CDRs. And this album, I connected with it on so many different levels. I love the riff structure. There's a lot of off kilter narrative. We say the word narrative a lot, but narrative is just a sense of continuity and progression within the songs. And Theron, I believe, they went into their opera-esque type of sound stuff after this album, but this is when they were still firmly entrenched in death metal. But they did have quite an abstract take on it, and there's some songs where you can just listen to it and just completely forget about everyday life. In my case, it was really connected with it when I was in military training. And I feel like it was a phenomenal expression of more of like a proggy type of abstract take on death metal, but still firmly entrenched in traditional death metal, if that makes sense. Really great songcraft structures in this album. What are your thoughts, Shelley?
Yeah, it's one of these albums where it's basically everything I love about Swedish or even Scandinavian death metal. Like forget about Entombed, forget about Grave, forget about the buzzsaw guitar tone, everything. There are a lot of bands around that time that were doing something a little bit weirder, where they were taking the dark romanticism of goth, borrowing a little bit from the aesthetics of maybe romantic era classical music as well, and as you mentioned, a bit of like progressive influence, but they were melding it in very strange ways with the fledgling death metal sound. And Therion was kind of at the forefront of that. Like listening to this, I do have mixed feelings, although I absolutely adore this album because you can sort of hear the germinal of where they would eventually end up with the operatic style. And people always say, well, that's when they got like, classical and symphonic or whatever. But the thing is, by that point, they were writing pop songs with an operatic flair. This is where they were actually trying to push the envelope with very odd song structures and unique kind of approaches to composition, and there was a flavor of that in there, but it was kind of kept at bay by a very strict adherence to the like philosophy of death metal. Still, it's still like entrenched within that extremity, that darkness, that monstrosity, um, and the ability to craft like just a really compelling um build and narrative with their riffs. Even the opening track, the way it unfurls on itself, I'd almost liken it to like Fog's Kiss by Sacramento or something, in the way that it just keeps going. Each moment like builds on the last and sort of unfolds in this really hypnotic way. But then you've got tracks like The Way, where they really do take you on a bit of an odyssey.
Yeah.
And yeah, you could sense maybe their ambition was running away with them a bit there, but you kind of have to still admire it, because it's just so, I know I use this word a lot about some of these albums, but it's quite audacious what they were doing. And to have that alongside tracks that are almost, grindcore in their sense of like primitivism, is a very varied, very unique album. But you can kind of see in the sort of narrative of Therion that they kind of thought they were transitioning to something new, whereas actually they'd hit upon the finished product in my eyes, and this is it in terms of like the apex of Scandinavian death metal in general, I think.
Yeah, for the when I think about like Swedish death metal, I always think of Dismember as being the best. But when you think about the HM2 Boss pedal, the Buzz guitar, Shelly, you have a different screen up, but yeah, this album is definitely a testament to how great Scandinavian death metal was back then. And I forgot to mention also, I know a guy who has a PhD in classical piano performance, and one of his favorite bands is Therion. But when we had some drinks one time, he was talking about how he likes the later Therion and doesn't like the early stuff. I'm like, we come from two different sides of the piano, bro. Like,
Well,
or
conversely, so when you and I were hanging out in London and you met a couple of friends of mine, uh, one of them just had never bothered with early Therion because he just assumed it was all of the operatic stuff. And then I had to send him Beyond Sanctorum, and he was like, "Holy shit! Like I never realized Therion sounded like this before." I was like, "Yeah, this is what they used to be, but it's kind of buried under their later career now."
Yeah, yeah, just obviously they got really big with the operatic stuff, but this was like the foundation, and I feel it was more authentic than what they went with the neoclassical operatic stuff later. And I remember hearing their later stuffs on the Death is Just the Beginning compilations back when I was a little kid. I would buy, anything death metal that had from a list from Alan Moses. He wrote like the best, extreme metal albums, and also found these compilations that were in record stores. And Therion was definitely a part of that. And I never really liked the operatic stuff, but I can see the novelty of it and why people like it. But the soul of the project is certainly in this era of and I think Beyond Sanctorum is the best album by far from Therion. So next up we do have Acheron, Rites of the Black Mass. We did have Vincent Crawley on the podcast at one point in time, so I was able to pick his brain. Actually, the next day we talked with Michael Ford from Black Funeral, in the Greater Church of Lucifer. So I had a very satanic weekend because I know Vincent Crawley was also part of the Church of Satan. He was a priest there, and that really comes into Acheron. So there's a lot of ominous satanic verses that he recites in Acheron. It would be a B for me, but I feel that Acheron is very good for what it does. I just don't. I don't believe there's a lot of uh elements that can push it to like an A or S tier. I would put it, I guess, a B, and Shelly's gonna put it as a C. I do think it's kind of overwrought with all of the intros between the songs, and you listen to the riffs, it's kind of doomy, like a Samuel Blood Ritual a little bit. And I think Samuel did that style a little bit better, but I still like the album. It's not a bad album at all. But Shelly, go ahead. I think you ranked it as a C.
Yeah. It's like a death metal version of Impaled Nazarenes, like Tolcom Nose, whatever that album's called. Not just with all of the intros and interludes, but also like the kind of black and thrash grinding thing. But this album has more obvious death metal elements to it. You know, you'll get a jarring tempo change every now and then. You'll get a more obviously death metal riff, but I think it very much sits towards the black metal end in terms of like crossover. And again, I know this was sort of released before the distinction was quite as solid as it is today, but yeah, there's sort of the the impression I get from this album is like its bark is worse than its bite, in that the aesthetics are there, the malevolence and evil and like dark occultist atmosphere is there, as are the theatrics. But when you dig down to the riffs themselves, I found it a little bit disengaging. To some extent, you know, it's the same impression I get from Impaled Nazarene, aside from Ugra Karma, in that they're they get by on sheer energy and like outrageousness alone, whereas the actual riffs and the interconnection and the development of theme is still very kind of underdeveloped compared to some of the bands on here. So yeah, it would definitely be a C for me.
Hmm. So also I want to mention that I was roommates with the guy from Acheron, Bill Koblack, also goes by the name of Belial, who's also been on podcasts before, and one of my former drummers, Mike Browning, was also in Acheron. But I did interview Vincent Crowley one time. So I do view that it's like that 1 degree of separation is there, which I might have a nostalgic take on that band. And I know you not being involved with any of the individuals of Acheron, you're just looking at it empirically. So that's okay. So next up is Fleshcrawl. One of my favorite death metal songs is on this album. Lost in the Grave, I believe it's called. That ending riff. Holy shit, I love that. So Fleshcrawl is definitely the band I like most from Germany for death metal at this point in time. Really, really solid album, and it does have like one of the best death metal songs, "Lost in the Grave." I think every aspect of that song. I know a friend of mine, Carl, he also has the same opinion on this album. But yeah, strong A for me, and I view that this is one of the exemplary death metal albums from Germany at this point in time. Go ahead, Shelley.
So I'm just gonna move it where I believe it should be. So I'm placing it as a B. I don't think it's a bad album. It's a fine album. I almost think it's like the follow up to Soulside Journey that we never got from Darkthrone in a way, because a lot of the riffs, it is more explicitly like doomy in a lot of places, but a lot of the riffs toy with a very similar thing that Darkthrone did on that album, in that they're crafting quite unique but very traditional melodic content with this very eerie, uncanny kind of structure to it. But they're sustaining notes for a little bit past their comfort zone, making you feel a little bit unsettled without, the polar opposite to Deicide's Legion. They're not bludgeoning you over the head with brutality or an excess of information. They're actually trying to make you feel a little bit more empty and what's the word? Like there's a little bit of a void at the heart of it that kind of does unsettle a little bit more, that sense of nothingness. And I found that really interesting. But I think the album is a little bit unfocused. It's a little bit bloated. It is nearly an hour long, I think. And it could have done with like trimming some of the fat away. But I do agree, as far as like German death metal goes, and there isn't much of note as far as German bands go as compared to other scenes. I know we've got another band coming up on here from Germany, but it's definitely sort of one of the better ones I've heard from that country. But yeah, I couldn't rate it higher than a B personally.
I think you need to play Lost in the Grave on repeat like 5 times. And it's such
Fair
a
enough.
great song. But I respect your opinion, Mr. Shelley. And I also view that Flesh Crawl is kind of one of those interesting bands that, I think this is more of their authentic period where they did adopt the Swedish, HM2 boss pedal later, and they just sound like generic Swedish death metal later on. But Next up we have the Vader, the Ultimate Incantation, one of the first metal albums period that I had bought, and it was recommended by Alan Moses. I got it when I was 12 years old. Can you believe that, Shelley? 12 years old, I had this album. And uh so this was obviously one of my entry bands into extreme metal. I would rate it as an A. There are some filler tracks on here, and there's definitely a thrash influence that's prevalent throughout. So I wouldn't consider it like, Onward to Golgotha as being 100%, death metal, like the Platonic form of death metal. I would view like Vader as being like 50% death metal, 50% thrash. There's some great tracks on this album. I think it ends on a very high note. And I understand back when they started this band, like I think Poland was under communist rule, and uh he Peter, in which I met Peter at one point, and there was another guy in Vader at the time that we went to my car and I just blasted Schubert and we drank vodka. And that what happened. Oh my God, this was a horrible experience. So obviously I was too drunk to drive home, and I realized that. And I hung out with Vader, and before that I was at a radio station drinking with Zeus from Plutonian Shore, because he was being interviewed, and I knew the DJ. And but anyway, I went to the show, and Vader hung out with them, and Vital Remains actually was on the bill too, and their Gator was in my car drinking vodka too. We had cranberry juice and vodka, and I I I realized I was too drunk to drive home, but I had already driven like a mile. And I just pulled into the closest parking lot and just like, I have to sleep this off. I'm too fucking gone to drive. And next thing I know, there was a fucking cop tapping on my car. And so I get out, and I had slept off most of my alcohol, inebriatedness. And he let me go because I didn't have my keys in the ignition. But that was a wake up call for me. It's like, take taxis, take Ubers, Jason. If you're going to get trashed, don't get fucking arrested. So, but anyway, that was a little tangent on experience with first degree stuff, as we had prior mentioned with Acheron there. Also, Bill Koblak, the roommate that I had, he was also in Incantation for a while, but I think everyone's been in Incantation, honestly. They've had so many people in the band. But yeah, it's a strong A for me, a very influential album. I don't think they've ever topped this album. We can talk about Sophis and other releases that they had. I did, being young, I did explore Vader all the way to what was that album, My Revelations or whatever, where they did take a more poppy format of death metal. But yeah, I feel this strong death metal album, definitely not S tier. It's definitely lacking in some ways, and I think that is the thrash influence just because of the time that they came up. But yeah, strong A. Go ahead, Shelley.
Yeah, I hesitated with that. I was going to place it as a B for me, but I think I'd rate it as an A because I was kind of thinking about other Vader albums and like Black to Blind and things I do really rate quite highly, but they kind of so you're correct in that they formed in like the early 80s, and yeah, Poland was still behind the Iron Curtain at that point, and they were one of the first like death metal bands or extreme metal bands, full stop, I think, to emerge from the Eastern Bloc. And obviously when the Soviet Union collapsed, they were able to distribute their music more widely, and the Ultimate Incantation was like it wasn't like a new band, although it was their debut. It was like they'd been honing their craft for quite a while, so this was like quite a mature expression for them compared to some of the other bands on this list that kind of came out the gate with something a bit wild and left field or whatever. So this is more of a refined group of musicians, and I do rate it. I think it combines some really kind of clever combinations of various elements of like European death metal with the Floridian style, a little bit of percussive elements going on, but also very, very strong Slayer influence. As you can imagine, they started out more on the thrash side, and that kind of holds over, but it doesn't dumb down the music in any way. It's still very much sophisticated death metal. And I know our friend and colleague Tyler, I think he rates this album very highly. So I'm not sure if he put it in S, but he definitely wouldn't be putting it in the B. So yeah, I think I I can rate it on an intellectual level and appreciate what they're doing on that level, but
Just be
it's never.
honest. If you think it's a B, it should be a B, and we can put it between an A and a B. I mean, I shat on some of your albums
No,
for
no,
so 2023 last week. So if you view it as a B, we can put it between an A and a B.
no. I think intellectually I know it's an A, but in my heart I think it's a B because um, I think I listened to it quite late on in
I do
my.
think there are some filler tracks in it that just don't really add anything to the album. So
Yeah, it's not. It's definitely not up there with your atheists and your Deicides and your Orbit Angels, but there is. It is still like a worthy kind of addition to the like golden era of death metal. And I kind of appreciate that more on an intellectual level than I do on an emotional level. So no, I will happily stick with A,
all right.
and that is not me trying not to offend anyone. Don't worry.
All right. So do you agree that Obituary, the incomplete, should be a D?
A D.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So I know, Shelly, you're not a fan of Cause of Death, but that was another one of my first death metal albums. I think I got that
No,
or
Cause of Death is the only Obituary album that I actually rate, but I think I only rate it because of 4 or 5 guitar solos.
because of James Murphy.
Yeah, basically.
All right, so the incomplete. This was after Obituary blew their quote unquote load. They're still aping death metal-y Celtic Frost type of riffing, very simplistic and groove oriented. And this was just when it became like an algebra formula for them. And there's nothing really to add to their oeuvre at all at this point in time, musically and artistically speaking. Like I said, Cause of Death was the last like really good Obituary album, which Shelley is not a fan of that, so I'm at odds with him on that. But I view like, yeah, it was just too much of a formula. There's nothing really added to this. This is music for people who don't like metal and they just like the groove oriented aspect of music, I should say. And just like the heavy textures correlate with that with just really bouncy types of riffs and uh I would say like this is like the I I used to term knuckleheaded, but I use that with the term of endearment with some bands like gutted, but this is knuckleheaded, but not with the any endearment. So go ahead, Shelley.
Yeah, Obituary are like a step up from Cannibal Corpse for me. They were the first to, one of the first, I should say, to popularize death metal, but that doesn't mean that they're the best or they're adding anything. If anything, the fact that they popularized death metal kind of is indicative of the um accessibility of Obituary, and that they kind of, yeah, you're right, they kind of dumbed it down to pop music with attitude. The reason I like Cause of Death, I do rate that album. It's probably the only Obituary album that I do rate. Is the tracks are a little bit longer. They do kind of lean on the Celtic Frost thing a little bit too heavily. And obviously, I know there's a Celtic Frost cover on that album. But it's elevated by some really, really good, really expressive guitar solos. But beyond that as well, they do try to kind of stretch themselves as musicians a little bit, especially if you compare it to Slowly We Rot. But this album, you kind of get the sense that they are just hitting a formula. They know that they've got a captive audience by this point, and they are, yeah, dumbing down every aspect of death metal to basically thrash on Valium is how I'd liken it. They're not adding anything in terms of like a melodic vocabulary. They're not adding anything interesting rhythmically. Um, I guess you could make a case for John Tardy's vocals being quite unique in the fact that he doesn't really sing lyrics. He kind of just speaks in tongues to kind of match the music. That isn't enough to salvage what Obituary are. I think they're probably, aside from Cannibal Corpse, one of the most overrated bands to come out of the American scene anyway. So yeah, strong D for me, and I think that's even being a little bit generous.
I wouldn't put it as an F. I understand that because if like we have Cannibal Corpse coming up, which I think would be an F, but I think it's a little bit better than that. I think they
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So next up is Malevolent Creation Retribution. Uh, so I view this as the best Malevolent Creation album. I would put it as between an A and a B. And I always like, I don't know what it is when it comes to Malevolent Creation and Monstrosity, but I kind of lump them together for some reason in my mind. I know they're both from Florida and their bands start with an M in their band name. But I feel like this is like the Malevolent Creation album to listen to. The songs, there's a lot of logic behind the riffs. It actually expresses something. But I don't really visit it that often. I don't really revisit Malevolent Creation at all, honestly. But when I was really into like all death metal, I did like this album the most. So yeah, between the A and B for me. Go ahead, Shelley.
Hmm. See, I would have been with you prior to this, but when we did the Death Metal 1991, I re-listened to Ten Commandments for that, and I actually think that almost competes with this album as far as like quality is concerned. I think they may be on about a level. Um, the thing I love about Malevolent Creation is the fact that they get the blind fury of say a Deicide down, but they do pack in the complexity and technicality of suffocation, or maybe not a Gorguts, but coming close in these kind of really mechanical percussive punches, this really kind of tight, locked in riff geometry where the drums are getting up in the grill with the guitars and kind of framing the riffs rather than just providing basic backbeats and so on. But they do it in a very fluid, very smooth way, the way the each passage just keeps coming at you in a relentless drive. Not quite as good as like Legion for that, but very similar kind of um breeze blocks of intensity just coming at you. The reason I put it in the A is because I think I would probably rate it an A. I do kind of get where you're coming from with the monstrosity, though, in that I think they are very similar in their approach, in the sort of way they try to make very, very dense but very, very flowing percussive death metal, but that's still linked with a sense of melody and lyricism in a way that, say, Suffocation wasn't, where they were just all about the mechanical chugging and rhythmic like brutality. In terms of the ranking, I'm not sure where that puts it because there's only two of us. You've rated it between an A and a B, and I've rated it an A.
It's an A.
It's an A, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of just because I don't listen to it often, I'm not really compelled to listen to it again. That's why I put it between an A and a B. But when I have listened to it in the past, I've really enjoyed it. But yeah, I guess what I want to return to often is going to be the S tier. That's the timeless classic. So A's fine.
Fair enough.
All right. So next up is Miasma Changes. This is one of those albums that I heard later in life, and wondering why I had never heard it before because this album is fucking ballsy. It's right in your face, great riffs. But it's one of those things like, yes, it is a firm statement of death metal. You're going to put it between a B and a C.
Yep.
But yeah, it does kind of peter out. I'm good between a B and a C. Yeah, there's some strong riffs here and there, but like we have the Atrocity coming forward. I also found that later in life, and I view that much higher than the Miasma. Go ahead, Shelley.
Yeah, this Miasma album is kind of what the Acheron album should have been or could have been, I think. Like again, it's definitely within the death metal camp, but it's similar in terms of like the occultist malevolence, strong primitive thrash influence going on, and quite a bit of like the black and grindcore a la Impaled Nazarene again, although there are very clear differences between the two. Um, and the Acheron, after listening to the Acheron and then listening to Miasma, just the Miasma just kicks the crap out of it in terms of just this animalistic fury. But I have the same problem with this as I do with the Acheron as well, in that it's just too primitive. I'd rather listen to sort of full on black metal that has that sense of atmosphere and theatrics that kind of compensates for the primitivism. Um, and it kind of does something a little bit more profound in terms of being explicitly minimalist, whereas this is still trying to be quote unquote like traditional metal as like you know a direct descendant of late thrash and early death metal, and for that it's just not doing enough, especially by 1992 where death metal had kind of reached a state of maturity where it was probably almost just passing its peak. It's some of its best, like finest work was going to be made in 1992, but it was also starting to show signs of faltering a little bit. We've already discussed Obituary kind of passing their peak a little bit. Deicide and Incantation had made their like defining statements and would soon kind of decline as well. And some of the other albums on here are a little bit like from left field. So death metal was at that kind of heat death moment. And Miasma is kind of symptomatic of that in a way, in that they're trying to expand on a style that was probably going a bit stale by this point. It's sort of like a holdover from 1985 or something with Possessed Seven Churches, where it's like the last in the line of that. And for that, it feels like an artifact of a bygone age. So yeah, I can't really rank it much higher than that when we're comparing it to some of these albums.
Yeah, I mean, the first time I heard it, I'm like, whoa, this, I had never heard this before. These riffs are good and all that, but yeah, I don't revisit it. I do think it kind of peters out. And when music peters out, it's not narrative. And I don't like using that term narrative. It's like, I know these guys aren't writing books, they're writing death metal. But that's just a descriptor that we use for songs that go somewhere. But next up is Sinister Cross the Sticks. Strong A from Jason. Very, very strong A. I think I discovered this album when I was 16 or 17. Really loved it a lot. I think I actually like Hate a little bit more than Cross the Sticks, which I know is blasphemy for some people, especially the quote unquote elitists out there. But I view that Hate was like the more death metal-y in your face form. Is I think there's still like some thrash influence with how the riffs are constructed in Cross the Sticks. But very, very fucking strong album. And they I think they did re-record some of the albums or the songs from this album on a later release, and it still sounded like really fucking strong. Strong A from Jason, Sinister Cross the Sticks. And are they Dutch? I forget where they're from.
Yeah,
Um,
they're Dutch. Yeah.
yeah. I think it's one of the best Dutch bands. So yeah, and what happened to this band after Hate? I have no idea. They completely dropped the ball. Aggressive Measures that has, some good riffs here and there, but yeah, not anything like Cross the Sticks. So A from Jason.
Yeah, I'll stop trying to rank them while you're talking because it kind of it it anticipates what you're going to say. So for me, it would be a B.
Would you
But
rate Hate higher?
well, yeah, I was about to say I'm actually with you in that I do prefer Hate as far as like kind of a similar kind of impression I get as the Deicide's Legion in that everything is so unified and locked in, but they managed to get this, barbaric fury across. But the way the drums kind of inform the riffs is really compelling. But the reason I like Sinister's approach to that, which is different to Deicide's, is Sinister are more explicitly like an evolution of thrash. You can hear the Slayer riffs in there, and you can almost see it as like Sinister's form of death metal is thrash in its final form, in its mature state. Because I kind of view thrash as like it never really got out of its adolescent phase. It never hit the state of maturity, and the reason is because thrash in its mature state is death metal, but some death metal is more explicitly thrash influenced than others. And I think Sinister is one of those holdovers where, if someone took the Slayer kind of approach to thrash and evolved it further, the reason we don't have thrash in its mature state is because we call it death metal and we call it albums like Cross the Sticks. And for that reason, I really respect it, and I do return to it quite a lot because it really does scratch that itch. But yeah, I rate Hate a little bit higher for kind of ticking those boxes. And again, some of these albums are just much, much closer to my heart. But bear in mind, B is still a really strong rating on this scale. So I'm not trying to do it down or anything, but yeah.
Yeah. All right. So next up we have Cannibal Corpse, Tomb of the Mutilated. I think we both agree that this is an F. And this is they have like their most iconic song on there, I Come Blood. But yeah, the riff structures, I tried listening to this the other day, and uh it's everything that it's like death metal texture, but not death metal songs, if that makes sense. It comes from a more I refer to them as like a Disney band, and I stand by that statement that it's not really it doesn't really communicate anything musically other than just being there. And I do view the obituary as being a little bit better than that. This is Cannibal Corpse had their formula down at this point in time too, but it's more like a poppy. It doesn't really communicate anything other than just shock value with the lyrics. It's a strong F from Jason.
Yeah, well, this is going straight into F territory. Um, Believe it or not, I actually prefer Butchered at Birth, because I feel like Cannibal Corpse, although they're very proficient musicians, and you can hear that on this album, but you could hear it earlier as well. Their like understanding or grasp of death metal is still incredibly primitive. And I think the reason I prefer Butcher to Birth is because they lean into that a little bit more, and it's more explicitly, this is just a mess of sloppy riffs like thrash offcuts and guttural vocals, and obviously the outrageous lyrics. Here, they are actually trying to be a bit more mature. They're living in a post-suffocation world by this point. They've tried to sharpen up production. They've tried to sharpen up the riffs, but their grasp of death metal is still not advanced any further than it was the previous year. So what you get is sort of death metal by meme almost, where, as you said, like you get all the signifiers of death metal. You get something that feels like it should be appealing to those different nodes that make death metal kind of work, that motivate it. But because nothing connects up, nothing really works. It feels like death metal by focus group in a way, or just a really kind of clumsy way to concoct all of the really most superficial elements of death metal into miasma. So I think that word's on my mind because we were just discussing miasma. But I'd prefer it if Cannibal Corpse leaned into that and just said, yeah, we're just a sloppy mess of different death metal signifiers. Whereas here they're trying to do something more mature and failing at it, which is just far worse than not trying at all.
Yeah, people consider them Floridian death metal, but they came from New York, so they're actually detached from like the Morbid Angels, the Deicides, and all that from Tampa. And they came down later, and just to be a part of a thriving death metal scene. They really I can see how they're like an entry level band for a lot of people, but honestly, if you're like 30 to 40 years old still listening to Cannibal Corpse, you should probably like have a moment of self-reflection.
Yeah, I was reading some of the Metal Archives reviews on this, people saying it's their favorite album of all time. I don't know how old these people are reviewing it, but I was also like, is it really? Like, have you heard some of the albums up here? Like, how can this be your favorite album of all time when, albums like this exist? Unless you either like it for nostalgia reasons or you don't understand death metal. Like, I know that sounds insanely elitist, but if you, I can understand you listening to Cannibal Corpse for fun or because they were really formative to you. But if you take them seriously or think that they're somehow up there with some of these albums, then honestly, yeah, you don't understand how death metal works.
Yeah, I agree with that. And they're an entry level band, I believe. And if you want to go further into death metal, and you'll discover the more quote unquote real stuff, which I know is a horrible term to say, but I just view like the spirit of Cannibal Corpse is nothing more than shock value, and the riffs are structured around that. And even later in their career, they had some riffs that aren't even like death metal. They're more like hard rock influence. But yeah. So next up is the Monstrosity, Imperial Doom, which also has the corpse grinder for Cannibal Corpse. So he wasn't on Tomb of the Mutilated, but he is on this Monstrosity. Um, very fucking solid album. I would make it a strong A. I think that obviously Monstrosity got overshadowed by Cannibal Corpse and the mainstream consciousness, But I view the riffs are actually really coherent and they flow together really well on Imperial Doom. I think it's a great album. Strong A from Jason.
Hmm. I'm probably going to place it as a B, but again, not trying to play it down or anything. Really strong album. Um, I think I prefer Millennium, where they sort of leaned into the tech death,
You're
progressive
right.
death
Yeah,
metal thing.
Millennium's a little bit better. Yeah, I'll concur with a B.
Okay, well, you don't have to on. What I was going to say was basically, uh, I think does a very similar thing to the Malevolent Creation in that it is quite dense and technical, but I wouldn't call it capital T technical death metal in the way that Gorguts or Suffocation are. You can kind of hear the germinal of that on Imperial Doom for sure, but I think just Malevolent Creation were doing something of a very similar style, but just a little bit superior in my eyes. Not to say that this Monstrosity album isn't great. I throw it on every now and then, and it really does. Um, I was going to say fit the bill, but I think I've been made fun of in the comments for that before. But it does fit the bill as far as like a certain brand of dense Tampa kind of style death metal goes. And but I think just the Malevolent Creation does it just that little bit better, which is why I'm placing it as a B, but very strong B again. So
Yeah, let's put it into a B. You're right. Millennium is a stronger album. So, and it's one of those bands I never really feel compelled to listen to, just in my own leisure. Move it further left. There's a spot open. But
oh, sorry. Oh
sorry.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, watching the Shelley navigate the tier list here.
It's my first time.
By the way, if you're listening on Spotify, please watch the video on YouTube. Like, subscribe, hit the bell, and so you can see what we're creating with the tier list. Next up is Nocturnus Thresholds. Obviously, I have another 1 degree separation from Nocturnus. Former roommate of mine plays in Nocturnus AD, and Mike Browning is my former drummer from After Death. Before I joined the military, I played with Browning. Uh, I think there's a really fucking phenomenal song on the song. I do think the key is better. I would rate the key as an A. Thresholds, I would put between a B and a C, but there's a really great song on here that everyone should hear called a Subterranean Infiltrator. I really fucking like the aesthetic of that song. And yeah, Thresholds, I view that's when they kind of started having the wrong reason for being in extreme metal where they wanted to get popular. They delegated Mike to just drums when he's also a phenomenal vocalist because obviously they wanted to have a stronger stage presence with the frontman. And I think that was a misstep. And obviously when they kicked out Browning, I think it was the ultimate misstep. But Browning's creative juices are definitely still here in the Nocturnus. The key is just Mike Browning unbridled, and which is continuing a lot of his lyrical concepts in Nocturnus AD now. But this album I don't view it as highly as the key. I would put it between a B and a C. But again, if you're ever curious about this album, listen to the song "Subterranean Infiltrator." Go ahead, Shelley.
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and agree with you. This is one of death metal's great oddities. It's kind of hard to separate the music from the story behind it. In that, yeah, as you mentioned, Browning was starting to be sidelined in this project. He was vocal duties were taken away from him and stuff. But also, like he founded this project, so it's kind of like it's one of these shitty stories where um it's obvious that he wasn't he's not the most technically proficient drummer. He's a fantastic vocalist, but he's one of these musicians where his creative juices kind of outstrip the raw ability, but he still kind of overcomes that. And the key is really sloppy as far as, quote unquote, progressive death metal goes. But the sheer creativity and will to kind of make it happen kind of shines through. Whereas here, you can tell the other members of the band were trying to make a more mature, sober statement, maybe trying to assert their position as far as progressive death metal goes, alongside, the Pestilence, IVth, Death, and so on. And it just comes off as a little bit faltering and a little bit stuttering. Browning isn't allowed to express himself as much behind the kit and sort of come up with these sort of wildly fast, but also really, really sloppy kind of blast beats. The guitars are a little bit too what's the word? Showy in that they don't really focus on crafting very compelling riffs or melodic structures. They just do average chugging thrash riff, pause for a guitar lick, average chugging thrash riff, pause for another guitar lick, and maybe add some keyboards in as well. And again, the keyboards, they're pretty average. Like
Yeah,
I can't
I
really
was
hear
never
them.
really impressed by Lou Penzer. Um,
No, he's no Rick Wakeman anyway. It's like
well, he's
yeah, I
no
know that.
Jason either. Like,
Well, no, he's definitely no Jason. But yeah, I know like the keyboards were his thing, but he's not exactly a virtuoso. He just kind of adds some nice synth textures here and there, but it's not like any anything beyond what a lot of death metal bands were doing at this time anyway. So yeah, trying to separate that, I do still appreciate there is the raw creativity. There's the sort of the world building going on, and just yeah, some really good moments on this album. But the lack of focus and the fact that you can kind of tell that it's a band pulling in different directions, it really does bleed through. So yeah, I'd agree with a B or a C on this.
also, I just want to put it out there, Shelly, if you didn't know that Mike Davis, the lead, like the main lead guitarist of Nocturnus, him and Trey Asgoth were friends and actually played together, just jamming on their own. And there was still like a Trey connection even in Nocturnus.
Well,
Because
yeah, I mean they were all
Mike
part of
Davis.
the same set, weren't they? Like down in
Yeah.
Florida, so that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, Damien Heftel, the lead guitarist of Nocturnus AD, well, one of them because Belial is also a lead guitarist, but he had also played with Mike Davis. So yeah, so it may not be Mike Davis playing in Nocturnus AD, but you have a guy who had played with Mike Davis. So it makes it a little bit more authentic, in my opinion. So next up is Napalm Death, Utopia Banished. Um, so I was kind of on the roast about including this album because obviously Napalm Death started out as a grindcore band, but I view this as a quite death metal album, and it's one that I tend to listen to from here and there, more often than a lot of albums on here personally. I do like Napalm Death. I may not agree with their politics, but I do like their music, and I don't hold it against them. Which is one of the great things about music being a unifier. Yeah, I would put it between an A and a B. I think that
That's high.
you don't like it, Shelley.
I do like it, but I wouldn't have put it as between an A and a B.
Well,
No, carry on. Don't let me stop you. Sorry.
okay, I'll just being nice. I'll put it in a B, a strong B.
You don't have you. Hey,
I
look,
like some
last week
bouncy songs on
when
here.
you roasted all of my albums of the year, you had complete conviction in your opinions. Now every time I disagree, you're like, "Oh no, I'll change my ranking."
Well, the thing
Where's
is,
the
I
data
listen to
with
other
conviction?
Napalm Death albums more. Okay.
Okay, all right,
All
okay.
right, that's the logic. Is actually I think Fear, Emptiness, Despair is better than Utopia Banished, but that's a personal opinion of mine. But yeah, it's there's some good tracks on here. I would definitely rate it as a B. I like it a lot, and I think it is more death metally than grindcore, so that's why it's in the tier list. Go ahead, Shelly.
Yeah, well, I agree with Napalm Death's politics, and I don't really like much of their music, so we're kind of the opposite there. Um, no, this album is actually my favorite of like the early death metal era of Napalm Death. So you have what British grindcore bands tended to do back in the early 90s, late 80s was they graduated into death metal and Napalm Death they went out to Tampa to record at Morrisound and made Harmony Corruption, which is one of the most boring ass albums I've ever heard in my life. Um, and all of the talented members of Napalm Death had moved on by the time Utopia Banished was released. You list like the bands that the members of Napalm Death went on to form, and it is like a collection of some of the most stunning extreme metal that England at least has produced. You know, you've got Cathedral, you've got Scorn, you've got Painkiller, you've got Godflesh. Um, but Napalm Death themselves were basically an entirely new lineup by this point. They had Shane Embury, but and the dude from Terrorizer, but kind of a collection of boring musicians that again were getting by on sheer charisma. But I like Utopia Banished because it retains the the cold industrial aesthetic that kind of really worked for a lot of the British bands. And it also does combine the really linear kind of grindcore from their early days with more of the kind of what's the word? There is like a melodic edge to this that kind of sets it apart from Harmony Corruption. Some of the riffs sort of stand out a little bit more, but the songs are able to gather around these centerpieces. And I think Barney's vocals are just that little bit more eccentric, and they kind of command the rhythmic emphasis of some of these tracks in a far more engaging way than our Harmony Corruption. So, although Harmony Corruption is for some reason considered the classic because it's the first Napalm death metal album, you're wrong. Utopia Banished is far more interesting, even if like texturally it's a little bit more homogenous. But yeah, I'd rank it a strong B. A rare B amongst their discography. I think after this it was kind of well, it hit
I
the
would
like
bring
groove metal
Fear
phase,
and
but
Despair as an A.
no, that album's pretty good. But shortly after this, I believe they went into kind of groove metal territory and then settled on the sort of whatever mashup hardcore grind death metal thing they're doing now. But yeah, strong B.
Okie doke. Next up is Bolt Thrower, the Fourth Crusade. That Warhammer stuff. I think there's only been one real crusade, so one day there might be a second one where the Christian people invade the Islam land. But yeah, I do like Bolt Thrower a fucking shit ton. And I think this album's quite good. And I actually a few years ago I was down at Hog Wild Records in San Antonio, and I bought like the best of Bolt Thrower, and I just play that on my car fucking CD player for like a month. And I've liked Bolt Thrower ever since I was a kid. And I know it doesn't really communicate much. It's just kind of obviously they started out more like a grindcore band and turned into death metal, not unlike Napalm Death. But they had more sensibilities when it came to riffcraft. Um, yeah, I would put it, because I do like Bolt Thrower a lot, and there are some good tracks on here. I would put it between an A and a B, Shelley.
So
And I do
just to
think it is more death metal than grindcore.
yeah, absolutely. Just to clarify, there were many Crusades.
Oh,
Um,
really?
yeah. The fourth one was perhaps the most brutal, hence the album and the lyrics to the title track.
Oh, I didn't know
Um,
that. I guess I need to brush up on history a little bit more.
it's an interesting subject, but it's not one that not one that we study at school, but it kind of just crops up in the popular psyche. But
Well, we talked about like the Knights Templars and all that. Wasn't that the first crusade?
yeah, so they were like I mean, I'm going to sort of talk like I'm a history buff, but they were an institution of like religious monks turned knights basically that were responsible for organizing the Crusades. But a lot of them were just peasants and farmers that were kind of recruited into this army and then just shipped off to the Middle East, where basically, bear in mind these are people that have never left their fucking village, let alone their country, to fight in this holy war. And I think the first one was where Richard the Lionheart kind of gained his reputation. But yeah, there were many beyond that where it was a combination of the church and the monarchy, and various kind of wealthy knights kind of funding these exploits, part pilgrimage, part military kind of invasion, with varying degrees of success. Because bear in mind, again, these were sort of very parochial Northern Europeans used to quite cold, damp climates going to the Holy Land where it's very dry and hot, and having to travel very, very far over land and sea. And yeah, meeting what was actually quite a sophisticated and very well organized civilization. So yeah, it's a fascinating tale over quite a few centuries. So it's worth reading up on. Anyway, the Fourth Crusade by Bolt Thrower is one of these archetypical transitional albums. We didn't discuss War Master on our 91 episode, and it's not because I don't think they're important. It's just for reasons of brevity, we had to cut it to just 20 albums, and War Master didn't make the cut. This one is like where they transitioned from the early, like, Slayer-esque hardcore punk mixed with death metal into the more mid-paced chugging entity that they kind of became known for Victory, and what a lot of bands took influence from. And here you see them trying to work that out. There are parts of this album I absolutely adore. There are parts of this album where I think it is a little bit just uh meandering and directionless, and they don't seem to know where to go with what they're doing except for playing the same kind of repetitive mid-paced chugging riffs over and over again. But when it's good, it is really, really good. So I think I would probably place it as a B. No, between an A and a B, because I do really love Bolt Thrower. They're one of my favorite bands. Sorry,
Right?
where did you place it, Jason?
Between an A and a B.
Okay, so we're in agreement there.
All right, so the next up is Cadaver in Pains, and I'm going to act as the vessel for Tyler today. I know he's unable to make today's episode, but I know Tyler would rank this as a strong A. I personally have not listened to it in about 10 years. Um, but when I did listen to it, I did enjoy it quite a bit. The riffs do have a lot of logic, and I know where Tyler comes from with the quote unquote narrative structure, songs that progress in a meaningful way. And Cadaver does have it. So I'm going to be the vessel for Tyler and rank it as an A. Go ahead, Shelly.
So I hadn't listened to it for many, many years until we decided to do this episode where I did give it another spin. Um, it's the best Pestilence album that Pestilence never made. It feels like what Spheres could have or should have been, in that it is progressive and technical, but it doesn't beat you over the head with that side of it. It's very disjointed. It's very non-linear in the way it constructs the narrative, as we keep discussing, and that's just really the way that the riffs communicate with each other and build on each other to the point where they are telling a compelling story through the construction of riffs, as opposed to just saying we've got this bit that's the verse, this bit that's the chorus, and this bit that's the bridge, which is how most pop songs are written. The narrative is very much allowing the language of the riffs to tell the story, and this album does that to the nth degree. Um, I think I definitely rank it as an A, as well, just because it achieves what progressive death metal did later, or actually was doing already by 1992, but just without the obnoxiousness, I guess you'd say.
Cool, cool, cool. You can move it further left than that.
I can, yep.
Yep. Make it all nice and phallic.
Into the
Um,
to the pro.
all right. So, yeah, Tyler, you're welcome. I acted as your vessel today. Um, so next up, we do have that massacre from France. A funny story is that I've been trying to get JP from Blight Mass on here to be a part of these death metal tier lists, and he's from France. Um, and Massacre is like one of the ultimate like French death metal bands from France. And I did listen to Massacre quite a bit because he had been recommending them to me. And my quibbles with Massacre is really that there is a very strong thrash influence. It may not come around in this album because it's more death metal riffage, but the song constructions are more like a thrash atmosphere derived from the late 80s. And I view because it does come from like a template essentially from how thrash songs are constructed, even though it is a death metal album, that does kind of falter because of it. And as such, I would rank it as between a B and a C. I think the material is strong. It's just the approach is wrong, in my opinion. So between a B and a C.
So I really love Final Holocaust and enjoy the violence. I do agree the thrash is strong with this one. Um, Similar to kind of Sinister in that it's not just, oh, there's still a bit of thrash there, and that's like a vulgar like holdover from a obsolete era. It's more just they've developed the style of thrash at that time into something slightly more mature and slightly more compelling. And they do kind of sit at that point where death metal was still discovering itself, a little bit like how I kind of view Master in a lot of ways. I know Paul Speckman was going for,
We'll talk
sort of
about
the early 80s.
We'll talk about Master on the next one.
Yeah, but I know he was going from like the early 80s and kind of started out in that and evolved death metal, evolved thrash to death metal. And Massacre kind of sit as a similar kind of stylistically. I place them in a similar box. But I'm less familiar with this album, so I might only have to give half a vote. And my instinct tells me that it's probably not as good as Final Holocaust and Enjoy the Violence, because those two albums were sort of not flukes of nature, but they were very much kind of came out of nowhere as far as like taking the absolute extremity of death metal at the time, but speaking in the language of thrash and kind of making thrash up its game into a level of complexity that it wasn't able to meet, because unfortunately it was sort of dominated by the voices of the big four that kind of kept on dumbing it down into sort of pop music by the early 90s anyway. So yeah, I'm going to agree with your ranking, which was it a B and a C, I believe?
Yeah, between a B and a C.
I mean, they deserve respect as well, because a death metal band from France, who ever heard of such a thing?
Yeah, they're more known for black metal nowadays. The
Yeah,
two different schools of black metal. You have the Mutilation school, and then you have Antaeus, and then you have like the Disso death shit, like Death Spell Omega. I think they're from France or something like that. I
they
think,
are. Yeah.
yeah, it sounds French to me, but it's something about French classical music too. I'm unsure if you heard this, Shelley, is that it either has too few notes or too many. And that kind of
So
comes through in some of their metal. Not Massacre. Massacre is definitely influenced by the California, thrash scene and the Floridian death metal scene and all that, and that seeps through in their expression. But next up is Cianide. I have a love-hate relationship with Cianide, and I view when we talk about like Chicago extreme metal, like what was really formative. I mean, Chicago had, of course, Cianide. They had Master, and then they had Macabre. Um, I would actually place Cianide above Macabre, because Macabre is more like a comedy band, just singing about serial killers. It never really like meshed well with me. But Cianide, I think it's quite bland. I've never been able to get into this band, but I do know they're competent, and I would rate them as a strong C. Go ahead, Shelley.
yeah, I really want to like Cyanide. Um, there's there's a similar kind of intent to say what Asphyx were doing, in that they are trying to make very ultra primitive, very glum death metal. They're trying to coat death metal in a sense of like drab, downbeat, depressive kind of gloom. But whereas Fix supplement that with energy and a very strong melodic offering, Cyanide really lack that. I think they lean too heavily on the sort of holdovers of Hellhammer, Celtic Frost, and they don't really develop their own voice beyond that.
Well, something that I
Um,
experienced in Chicago, because I did live in a suburb there for a while, because my girlfriend was there, and at the time, but I noticed that they have a very different like take on extreme metal, like how they present themselves in Chicago. It's very gentrified. Where in Texas, I had one guy, Hell Preacher Johnny, on here when we talked about Texas metal, and there was 7 different fights that broke out at the same show. And in Chicago, like I was the feral one, and I'm like in Texas, I'm the civilized one, and it's strange. Like one show I was up there, I played a band called Imperius, and I had learned all their songs on keyboards in like a week, and I played a show with them, and I got kicked out because of not a performance. Performance was fine, but because we played like a microbrewery, and and they had like a stage and stuff. It was a really nice place actually. It was very but everyone was like super civilized, and it was like polite society. And there was a band that came on stage called Withering Soul, and the guy was wearing a fucking cowboy hat while having corpse paint on. It looked fucking ridiculous. And me being inebriated, off the micro beers or whatever, the craft beers, I ran up on stage and I stole his cowboy hat because I was from Texas and I should be wearing it. And he just looked like a goober up there on stage. And it's back when I was more wild. Now that I'm older, I think my testosterone levels are dropping. I'm not as feral as I used to be, but and I do apologize to Withering Soul because I did that, but that just shocked everyone. I got kicked out of Imperius because of that. And like in Texas, that's a common thing. Like people just beat up each other. They make shenanigans out of, things that they think is clownish, which Withering Soul did appear to be very clownish to me. Uh and I kind of see where Cianide, growing up in that atmosphere as musicians is very civilized and doesn't want to, breach into the beyond, go to extreme. Um,
They've got the Milwaukee Metal Fest thing. That's not far from Chicago, though, is it?
it is not, no.
Yeah.
Not too far, but I think it's in Wisconsin. And Wisconsin, there's still some of that civilized aspect in Wisconsin, but they tend to be more alcoholics up there. So,
Because I know
um,
the Scale It Back guys from up there, and we interviewed him quite a while ago now. But
yeah, but yeah, what I think Master has been the best thing that the Chicago and Illinois has produced. Cyanide, I just think is very fucking generic. So strong C for
yeah, so to the point on the live show thing, obviously, like not advocating violence, but if someone steals your cowboy hat, that just speaks to the spontaneity of the live show. That's the whole point. Anything can happen. The crowd will interact, and sometimes they might say or do things that are unexpected. And being upset by that is, well, you might as well stay at home. But anyway, Cyanide. Yeah, let's stick this as a C. I'm not going to rank it any higher than that. So
Yeah, I think a C is fair. And this is usually the album that people say is like the best Cyanide. But then
I
again,
think it is. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, fucking Chicago sucks for metal. Honestly, we have Master at least to say that they're the champions. But I think Paul Speckman is living in the Czech Republic now. And yeah, we did chat with him quite a bit. Next up is Hypocrisy, Penetralia. I am not a fan of Hypocrisy. When I was younger, I did like them though, but I liked their later albums because I was dumb and stupid and I didn't have discernment. And I like the texture of Hypocrisy. Really nice death metal texture. But they had completely streamlined their expression into a more poppy form. This has more of like a not like Massacre with their template of thrash, but you can definitely tell like there's some thrashy riffs here and there. But Hypocrisy is always, as in my 30s, a C band. And this is perhaps their best album. When judging it, so yeah, strong C for me. I wish Hypocrisy like was better, but I understand that Peter Cochran, he's like a big heroin addict, and there's he might be off it by now. I know he's been playing with Lindemann, and Lindemann wouldn't allow heroin, hindering the success of the project, being professional and all that. But I know at one point in time, Peter Cochran was like really, really into heroin. Um, but yeah, I think this is the most authentic death metal release from Hypocrisy, and a strong C for me. I don't think it's D territory. There's a lot of competence at in the album, but it just it's not what I'm into. I'm sorry, Shelley. So where would you put it?
No, I think I'd agree. Looking at what we got in D at the moment, I wouldn't put Hypocrisy there, but I would definitely say this album goes from moments of pretty quality like riffing, sort of strong sense of melody, to moments of just seeming really unfocused. Like it's like they've by this point they've listened to a lot of death metal and they're trying to cobble together um their own version of it and just not really being able to get it over the line because they're not thinking about what they actually want to bring to the table themselves that might be slightly different, or honing a particular style really, really well. They're trying to do something quite broad and sort of being a jack of all trades, master of none, um, with this album, but definitely not D territory. So yeah, I'm going to agree and stick it in the C.
All right. So next up is Nuclear Death. A band that really isn't mentioned that much in the metal conversation. They had Lori Bravo, a female vocalist. We talk about like Durketa being a really great, like all female death metal band. Um, Nuclear Death had Lori Bravo. What she became as she became older is kind of shameful, but we won't get into that. Just really, yeah, not into anything after this album. But I think Nuclear Death, they had like a completely different take on death metal. Of course, there's strong thrash influence. We're talking about 1992 death metal still. You can definitely tell there's still a thrash influence, and Lori Bravo, like great performance on this album. I think they were really going for like a more artsy, abstract, modernist take on extreme metal, and to certain degrees, I think they did succeed. However, I never want to listen to it. So, being that it's competent and it did try for something, I'm going to put it between a B and a C, above average. And I would not want to join any conversation about what Lori Bravo has done since Nuclear Death. It's just not into that. So go ahead, Shelley.
I fucking love Nuclear Death, but uh, I've always compartmentalized them as a grindcore band in my mind. Although I know they're one of these bands that's like hard to place because, yeah, there is a strong thrash element there. There is the grindcore. There's obvious death metal riffs as well, but they were far too sloppy and freeform to be called death metal in my eyes. Like when you look at the formality of some of these albums, where it's very intentional, the way the riffs are structured and the way everything is put together, and the tempo changes, the way a drum fill will anticipate a particular shift um, in the sort of the structure of the riffs and so on. Whereas Nuclear Death are much more like just not noise, because there is still like elements of, I guess you could call it melody, but there is elements of music going on within Nuclear Death, but they're much less formal than what I consider death metal to be, especially with this album where they'd kind of dispensed with thrash altogether and, as you say, gone in a much more like modernist avant-garde direction where they're trying to combine elements of noise rock with death metal and with the what I guess you could call horror grind. They go for that very surrealist kind of aesthetic that's not like the sort of gore grind that was an aftershock from Carcass, or what Mortician would later become. It's much more weird and unsettling than that. A little bit, I'd kind of compare it to Blood in a lot of ways in terms of spirit, if not sound. But I'd say Blood are much closer to death metal sonically than Nuclear Death. But yeah, for me, I adore this band, but it does feel a bit wrong kind of ranking them on this scale. But for me, I would place this album as like a strong A.
Really?
Yeah. And you put it between a B and a C.
Yeah.
So that puts it basically as a B, I think, doesn't
Yeah.
it? But yeah.
Well, I mean, I
Yeah.
understand. Like they came from Arizona, and Arizona at the point in time was not known for any death metal or extreme metal, really. So they did kind of have that niche as being the only quality band from that area. But yeah, it's not something that I revisit. And when we talk about Lori Bravo, it's kind of like I wish it was better in the abstract than in reality. So next up is Sorrow. This is the album that Brett Claren did early on. He was on a Roadrunner or Relapse or one of those record labels, got pretty big. And we had him on the podcast to discuss his black metal band. That's why I included this because Brett Claren is a physics guy. He has a master's degree in physics. Really smart individual and kind of interesting take. Very friendly and approachable. When it comes to Sorrow, I of course discovered them later after we had interviewed Brett. Um, I think it was competent stuff. I think there was a lot of doomy aspects that perhaps like held back, like how extreme it could be. But yeah, I would put it in average territory, Shelley. I do like Brett Claren and I do hope him success. I just feel like at this point in time, there was just so much quality death metal and extreme metal being released that perhaps they didn't place, perhaps they weren't part of that zeitgeist to really, bring something special out. So, but it's very competent. Strong C from Jason. Go ahead, Shelley.
So yeah, this is I think it's the only album on this list that I haven't listened to, so I'm gonna have to withdraw my vote. But yeah, so Journey to Darkness, I mean they're a sort of project from a different era in that they're a newer project of Brett's, and they are, very, 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 very interesting and unique take on symphonic black metal. But yeah, I can't comment on this one, so a C it shall remain.
Yeah, I don't think it's bad at all. But when I had listened to it, I didn't derive anything like special. And I'm sorry, Brett, if you're listening, but yeah, I think Journey into Darkness has more potential. So next up is Morpheus Descends. Um, I believe this band, like I know we have Demigod coming up soon, and I like in the abstract. I kind of mix the two up quite often, like I did do with Monstrosity and Malevolent Creation. Uh, Morpheus Descends, New York death metal that definitely comes out in their sound. But there are these moments that it just does nothing for me. But I know it's really competent death metal, and I actually know a guy who was in the project, Tom Stevens. Um, he was also in the band Nocturnal. But he had played in Ripping Corpse and Morpheus Descends, and I would say it's a strong B. I know some people would rank it as a S tier, but I view like some of the riffs are quite generic in it, and when we talk about the narrative structure, I feel like there's some momentum lost in that aspect. There's not enough there to keep my attention. So, but it's more competent than most. So a strong B, if that makes sense, Shelley.
No, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, let's be right about this. Like, this is a quality album, and I'm not gonna play it down or anything. But I think one of the reasons this album is so hyped is because people want Suffocation, but more. Because kind of obviously Suffocation kind of went off a cliff after Peers from Within, but then people are like, well, you should listen to Morpheus Descends because they're from the same scene and they do a very similar style, and that is true. And this is a really good album. But let's not overplay its place in history because we're just craving that moment when Suffocation were really good in the early 90s. They do lend a romanticist gothic flair to that style, which is very, influenced by New York hardcore. It's very rhythm focused, very well. I know we keep saying this, but there's a holdover from Thrash as well. It's very atonal, very chromatic, but they do work in moments of high drama, I guess we could say. But yeah, you're right. There are passages in this album where I do just switch off, and where we're looking at some of these albums in the A tier, like every single moment will have me transfixed. Whereas this album, yeah, it just kind of loses my attention for significant portions. But that being said, still belongs in sort of the annals of like quality early 90s death metal. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and agree with a B ranking for this.
Okie dokie. So a strong B for the Morpheus Descends. I know they're on the internet canon, they're like S tier. I don't know why, but
It's because people want the obscure creds. They think, oh, I've discovered this really obscure band, and did you know they're awesome? And you probably haven't heard of them. And it's like, guys, everyone's heard of Morpheus Descends by this point. The internet's a thing. We can all discover the obscure bands. They're not that obscure and they're not that good. They are good, but they're not that good.
Yeah, I'm looking at some of the other albums on here, and yeah, B is a good placement for them. So we have next up Vital Remains, Let Us Pray. This is arguably their most true album. Of course, Vital Remains were always kind of in the underground and in the conversation, kind of in the background, until they came out with the album Dechristenize, which had like high flowing melodicism and really pushed them into the mainstream consciousness and metal scene. But before then, they had perhaps their strongest death metal album, Let Us Pray. And with this album, it kind of feels like they're the bits and pieces of other bands, but it's very competent. I would put it between a B and a C. Shelly, perhaps you haven't listened to it, but I think that's a good rating for it.
Well, yeah, like I said, I'm gonna go with your ranking. I might have listened to this many, many years ago, but yeah, my intimacy with this album is not such that I can really rank it in good faith. But I will say, can we just accept this is the best
Oh
album
yeah,
cover out
the album
out of the
cover
selection we have?
covers amazing.
Just,
That's just totally from the period too of death metal.
yeah.
It's like what they're trying to encapsulate. Yeah, but Let Us Pray, not a bad album. Granted, I haven't listened to it in quite a while, but I had listened to it in the past quite a bit. And especially when I had the anecdote about hanging out with one of the guys from Vital Remains drinking cranberry vodka. Yeah, I actually like it more than Dechristenize. Dechristenize is just like I don't think it was really death metal. Like some of those tracks, like when it's just melodicism, high flowing solos and all that, it's more like power metal-y to me. Whereas this is, straight up death metal. But next up is the Demigod, Slumber of Sullen Eyes. Much like the Morpheus Descends, like I view that some of the riffs are fucking phenomenal and it's like captures my attention and other points. There are moments that are really fucking boring to me. So
Oh, Jason, don't do this. Don't do this.
no, I was gonna say it's a B.
Oh, it hurts.
No, there are some boring passages on this album that always makes me want to turn it off.
Just because Tyler's not here as well, I have to be like, oh.
I'm sorry, Shelley. We have to disagree somewhere. Come on. It can all be
Yeah, I'm actually
just
surprised at how much we agree on 1992 death metal, but that's criminal.
no, there's some like passages that really just bore the hell out of me. But I know it's very competent death metal and it's above average. I wouldn't put it S tier though. Nowhere near S tier. And I think a B is where me personally I would put it. So I'm sorry, Shelley.
No, it's fine. I wouldn't put it S tier either. I'd probably put it between A and S because Demolic exists. Not on this list, obviously, because they were 93, but Demigod Slumber of Sullen Eyes is like finished death metal par excellence in that it encapsulates the chugging mid-pace bolt thrower-esque thing that a lot of the Finnish bands were doing, but it combines that with the oddball, very, very eerie, very eldritch approach to riffing. It's very uncanny and unsettling. But again, it manages this sense of eerie atmosphere without excessive use of keyboards. It does it all through riffs. The guitar tone is such that it elevates that, but actually it's really the strange left field approach to melody that really communicates this sense of the uncanny, and just the familiar made that little bit off kilter and that little bit strange. But that kind of rather almost fragile kind of aspect of this album is collided against just the sheer brutality of some of it. And this album does kind of pack a punch when it wants to. Yeah, I wouldn't rank it an S, as I mentioned, just because I think there are weirder, more profound expressions of Finnish death metal, but definitely between an S and an A for me. Where did you put it, Jason? A B?
Yes, it makes it an A.
That makes it an A. Okay, well, at least I've salvaged it a little bit there.
Yep.
Okay, fair enough.
So, Shelly, what do you honestly think about Last One on Earth by Asphyx?
Why'd you ask?
Because I like the rack so much more. And I only, casually listened to this album, and I understand it's very competent. I'll place it as a B. Um, do you think it's as good as the rack, Shelly?
Hmm. I was about to say I'd place this as an A, but I realized I placed the rack as an A, so maybe I'd place this between a B and an A because no, I don't think it's as good as the rack. I think the rack is a really strong album as a whole. Um, it works really, really well taken together and also has an incredibly strong closing track. Last One on Earth doesn't work as well as an album, but it does have maybe one half of an album that is really, really strong. So um, the Crusher, the title track, Streams of Ancient Wisdom, a few others where it's really strong, like Asphyx just pounding it out, like doing what Asphyx does really, really well in that they do very simplistic, but very brutal death metal, or they
Pretty
do really,
straightforward.
really well, or they do really kind of quite epic cinematic kind of dirges of doom where they do layer up very simple but very, very effective sense of melody. But then it has tracks like Food for the Ignorant, which just comes across as a little bit infantile at this point, where it is just sort of a bargain basement death thrash number, and it feels a little bit like filler. I feel like this album might have worked better as an EP, actually, like a strong or a 5 track EP, but a really, really strong one. So that's why it's going in the A territory, because when Asphyx are good, they are really, really good. But there's just a few tracks on here that are a little bit forgettable. But that's why I'd place it above, say, the Morpheus Descends, because when Asphyx are strong, it sticks in my mind. Whereas Morpheus Descends are strong, it's good, but it doesn't sort of burrow into my psyche quite as much.
All right, so it puts it in the A territory since I gave it a B.
Now I feel bad because it's right next to Demigod, and I think Demigod's way better. But never mind. That's the law, the anarchy of the tier list. So
Yep.
let's just
More about
move
the
it.
conversation.
Yeah, there we go. So next up is Atrocity.
Yeah. Um, I do have a dissenting opinion on the At the Gates that you
Oh,
just
not again, not again. Here we go.
yeah. Why not just create classical music if you want to be high-minded and lofty? there this is the album like that was touted around as the ultimate death metal album. And I have tried on numerous occasions to get into the Red in the Sky is Ours. I think it's competent. I think there's a lot of creativity that's been put into it, but there's nothing that really captures my attention overall with it. And I know it's complete blasphemy. And I know that I listen to classical music and I should have more sophisticated taste in music. Um, but yeah, I would rank it as a B, Shelley.
A B.
Yeah,
Ah,
I don't like it. I mean, I like aspects I know is competent. I think it's above average. It's definitely unique, but it's not something I ever want to listen to. That's why I wanted Tyler on this when we got into the second row because I knew he would defend it too. And it wouldn't be so much of a shock, but yeah, it's yeah, I can't rank it higher than a B, Shirley. I'm sorry.
that's fine. So okay, I'll just talk around the album bit because I'm assuming anyone listening kind of they don't need me to explain this album to them or why it's so
Well,
special. But
what happened after the Gates after this album? I mean,
well,
we have the Gardens of Grief EP, which is good. I think Gardens of Grief is better
I
than
think Gardens of Grief was actually before this, but
I think that one's better than this one. At least it's more concise. um,
uh, so yeah,
it
they
is.
did with Fear I Kiss the Burning Darkness, which is kind of a divisive album because some people see it as like a trial run at the shitty Melodeath direction they took. But I kind of see it as an interesting kind of, again, one of these oddities of death metal where it is explicitly melodic death metal, but it is melodic death metal what it should have been, in that it is really kind of tangential, meandering, very unpredictable, and very interesting and unique in the way that it employs melodic language alongside the atonality and chromaticism of death metal, and it does build on the foundation of the Red and Sky Azars. Whereas melodic death metal became essentially, Iron Maiden with some like blast beats or whatever. The Carcass, Heartwork, the Slaughter of the Soul, the In Flames his entire career, Arch Enemy, and so on. That's what melodic death metal became. But when you have the Red and the Sky Azars, and I wouldn't say with Fear the Kiss, but with Fear I Kiss, at the gates, man, you needed to shorten your album titles. With Fear I Kiss the Burning Darkness, I wouldn't rank it quite as high as this one, but I'd still say it deserves respect for, again, trying to push the boundaries of melodicism within death metal. And this album in particular, again, you think about what's going on at this time in Sweden, in Tombs.
It's melodic, progressive death metal.
But you think about what at the gates were compared to at the time. They were working against Entombed, who are probably one of the biggest bands around from their country at the time. But we also have, the likes of Bolt Thrower. We have Death getting big and Cynic getting big for doing the jazzy, like funky death metal. But then you have At the Gates saying, no, we're not going to make some skull bludgeoningly heavy album, and we're not going to make some jazzy, spacey, progressive death metal album. We are just going to explore the potential of melody. And I know you're going to come back and say I'd rather listen to classical music, but classical music isn't the only medium through which you can explore this. And I think At the Gates, again, given this was their debut album, they were very, very young. They were trying to craft a niche within death metal, and they basically ended up creating their own vocabulary, one that could be expressed through guitars, but also, as we see on this album, through violins as well, through very, very unique approach and fluid approach to rhythm. But it's one, as we discussed previously, it's not uppercase P progressive. It is progressive and it is technical, but it's not explicitly so in the way that Atheist or Cynic were. It's very much just, let's push the boundaries of melody to absolute breaking point. And they come up with this statement of just utterly unique, dark romanticism that just, as with the other albums in the S tier, every time I listen to this, I discover something new to love about it. I discover a new angle, a new layer that At the Gates brought to the table. And yes, it was probably an absolute fluke, because with Fear I Kiss the Burning Darkness is slightly more direct and slightly more transparent in the way that it manipulates melody, although I still think it's quality. But yeah, this album is just, it has that underlayer of magic that can't quite be quantified. But I understand, with all the words in the world, I'm not going to talk you around. If you have a slightly more tepid reaction to it, that's fine. You're entitled to your opinion.
Well, I just feel like all the elements that created Slaughter of the Soul is also in this album, by having a surface level take on melodicism and creating what was Slaughter of the Soul? Is that deathcore? Is that metalcore? Like,
It's called like mellow death, melodic death
death.
metal.
It's antithetical to death metal, and I think all the component pieces for that to be created is in this era of At the Gates. I don't understand why this band is so big.
Well, in a sense, you're right, because Slaughter of the Soul, it borrows the same melodic language, but what it does is it hacks it up so that it can be placed into easily digestible chunks of basically pop rock songs, but with the melodic language of The Red and the Sky Azars. Whereas The Red and the Sky Azars, it uses the same vocabulary, but it creates a much more meandering, complex, labyrinthine story with it. The reason Slaughter of the Soul doesn't work, and the reason an album like Heartwork doesn't work, is because it takes these chunks of sophisticated metal that we like, and it segments them into bite-sized pieces, so that if you have a short attention span, you can think, well, it doesn't matter, the showstopper chorus is coming up, or the Iron Maiden-esque guitar solo is coming up, or whatever. So you're right in a sense, but I disagree that that makes this album bad, I think.
So I think we need to discuss just how I approach melodicism as a person who's been playing piano forever. I create melodic melodies easy breezy just by putting my fingers on the keys and just playing a major chord or whatever. And I don't derive any enjoyment from melodies that are crafted from such an easy approach. I like stuff that is very idiosyncratic. I like stuff that threatens our notions of music theory. At the Gates, I view as very entrenched in music theory and on a sheer melodic aspect, it does not resonate with me because it just seems like the easiest path. Because in melodicism, if you know a thing or two about music theory, it's very easy to create, and I just that's why it doesn't resonate with me, Sean.
But there's a sense of you can work within the theory and the conventions and still slip something weird and off kilter under the radar. This is why I respect bands today that are not trying to do anything too dissonant, too out there in terms of noise or what we'd call avant-garde metal now, I guess, or experimental metal, although those terms are quite vague. This is why I respect bands that work purely within melody because it almost looks like experimentalism because you're limiting yourself to just expressing everything through very, very traditional means where you'd think everything that could possibly have been expressed has already been done so. But then if you come up with something where it's like, actually, no, this is really weird and really novel, that to me is far more revolutionary. And that's why this album works so well, because they work in such sort of standard, very, very, traditional melodic shapes, but they come up with an artifact that is utterly unique to my mind. I mean, we don't have to dwell on this because I think we're spending quite a long time talking about this album. So, but we clearly have different opinions on it. So I think we've unpacked.
Yeah,
Your,
I do have a very
fair enough.
unpopular opinion on At the Gates,
So,
especially
sorry, where were you rating it? Was it a B?
it was, yeah. And
Sorry,
I'm not
so it
gonna
has to,
budge from it. I'm not gonna
has
budge
to
from
sit as a. Oh no, sorry, Tyler. Sorry, everybody.
it. I know it's a dissenting opinion, but it's just us two today.
Hey, it's your opinion, man.
I think I have an educated opinion, but Atrocity, the German title name, Todessehnsucht or whatever, the longing for death, I think is what the English translation is. I fucking love this album. I think Atrocity only released one really good album, and it was this one. And I would place it as an A. There's a lot of great hooks and a lot of catches, and the way the album flows is really good too. Like it kind of transitions more into like a thrashy thing, and he deleted something. Yeah, Control
Oh,
Z.
sorry.
He did the Control Z. You're good. And yeah, I would rate it as a strong A. I think that if this band kept their heads on straight, that they could have been a great force within death metal, but they only released one good album. And what's on this album is really fucking fantastic. So strong A from Jason.
Uh, now I'm fucked because I can't rate this an A because that puts it next to the Red in the Sky as ours. Um, no, I'm kidding. In all honesty, I think I would put it as a B. This kind of death metal is right up my alley as far as being kind of encapsulating all of the what we'd call the raw material of the American style in that it has the bludgeoning, thrashy elements, the brutality, the technicality, just the raw percussive energy, but it works in that dark, romantic, and theatrical side. And also, it's just not afraid to be a bit ridiculous. And I really like the melodrama of that as well. And that's one of the things that I love about Northern European death metal and extreme metal in general of this era is that it's just very, very unabashed in its freedom to express itself, even if that makes yourself look a little bit silly at times. But similar to the Hypocrisy, I think it lacks focus to some extent. And you're right, if these guys had stuck with death metal and built on this foundation, they probably could have created something really, really profound. But unfortunately, I mean, it's a bad sign whenever you search for a band on Metal Archives and the genres are listed as various, in that they've touched on so many things that even the user can't update how much they've kind of dabbled in. But yeah, for me, this would be a B. But if they'd released a follow up and it had been slightly more focused, could have been into A territory for me.
I can understand how you can see it as unfocused. Yeah, but the songs are fucking good.
They are, no,
I
they
would
are.
rank it
But
as
like
an
I said,
A.
B is a strong ranking on this list. Like it's not a damning indictment. It's a B is a strong album that I will listen to fairly frequently. So
All right, so next up is the Autopsy after they blew their load and came into the formula of Autopsy. It would be a strong between a B and a C from Jason.
fair, yeah, me too. Like we're Mental Funeral, nearly a perfect death metal album. Here we just sort of we have Autopsy doing their thing. Fine.
Yeah, all right, let's move on. Is that Torture next? I couldn't,
Torture, yeah.
yeah, I could
They have a
not get into,
German band.
couldn't get into this band. I understand like they might be internet canon or whatnot, but it does nothing for me. I think it's very competent death metal, and it just expresses nothing like unique to me. So strong C.
Oh, okay. I would have ranked this as a B. They are internet canon in the same way that maybe Morpheus Descends are internet canon, but I think these guys have more right to be in that again, they combine elements of atmospheric death metal with the more bludgeoning, violent aspects of death metal in a very, very convincing way. It's a little bit underdeveloped in places, as is the case with seems to be with a lot of German death metal, in that it feels like these guys, if they'd gone on for longer and built on this foundation, they could have really come up with something quite profound. But here we see the germinal of what would be a very good idea, a very sort of compelling approach to romanticist death metal. But it doesn't quite hit the mark. But I would rank it as a strong B, regardless of whatever sort of retroactive hype it's received on the internet. But
Well,
yeah,
I'm
you'd rank
looking
it as
what's
C,
in
did you
this.
say?
I'm looking at the C territory. I think I believe it should be there in the C territory. You have the Cianide, you have the Hypocrisy, and you have the
I'd
Sorrow.
rank it higher than the Cyanide. That's the thing.
All right, all right. So
So
here
Jackson, why is there a grindcore album on here?
it has death metal flavors. So I'm interested of where you would rank the Brittle Truth because I've never liked Brittle Truth. I would rank it as a D.
A D. Oh,
Yeah,
that is the brutal truth.
yeah, it's very brutal. I perhaps it is the grindcore that's more being pronounced in it, but yeah, never really got into Brutal Truth, and I understand this is one of their better albums. Um, but yeah, it does nothing for me. And I do think it's in terms of death metal, it's below average. Go ahead, Shelley.
So if it was Need to Control, that album is an S for me, regardless of the genre, whether it's death metal or grindcore or whatever. Need to Control is a near perfect album of extreme metal, as far as I'm concerned. This is what our friend and colleague Raphael would call preparatory, in that they are still preparing the ground for what they would become. Uh, I guess if you were around and into this music in 1992, this might have, and you were into grindcore, I should say, you might have been blown away by it. But I was around in the early 2000s after the fact and buying up these albums, and I listened to Need to Control first, which kind of ruined Extreme Conditions a little bit for me. Not to say that this is a complete stinker. I think there's really quality grindcore on here in a kind of way that I sort of feel like Brutal Truth did what Napalm Death were becoming, just way better than Napalm Death, in that they lent into the silliness of grindcore and they made it very, very extreme, very, very meat-headed, and as you would say, Jason, knuckle-headed at times, but very, very deliberately so. They kind of lent into the fact that they were making really dumb, primitive music at times. But I also appreciate the fact that they tried to be a bit more intelligent with it, but not in a very obnoxious way, just in a very sleight of hand, trying to work in more complex, longer tracks now and then, trying to be a little bit more avant-garde in places when it works without just bludgeoning you over the head with how special they are or whatever. I think they nailed that on Need to Control, but on this album, there are some filler tracks, there are some forgettable riffs, there are some moments where you just kind of think, well, that's not really grindcore anymore. It's more of an offcut of a death metal track, but because you're writing in 1992, it sounds like very, very average death metal. But I'd probably place it between a B and a C. So you placed it as a D, so that places
It's
it
a C. It's a C.
as a C. Yeah. Well, to be honest, I think I'd be happy with a C. I'd be okay with that.
Yeah, Brutal Truth is. I always like Napalm Death more.
Oh,
But
okay, I'm the opposite. No, don't get me wrong. I like the first two Napalm Death albums, but I feel like after From Enslavement to Obliteration, you should move on to Brutal Truth's Extreme Conditions and then Need to Control. And I think that's a much better, takes you through a much better journey of like the political activist side of grindcore, with a side of maybe Terrorizer as well. And you can kind of forget about the Napalm death metal era at that point. You can just move on to Brutal Truth. But if you're talking about like death grind, obviously you go from Carcass through to Blood and then maybe Nuclear Death and so on. But that's obviously a different lineage to what Brutal Truth were doing.
yeah. All right. So you happy with today's rankings other than a few blemishes in your opinion?
Yeah, aside from what you did to Demigod and At the Gates, I think I can live with the rest of it. It'll be very interesting to see what Tyler thinks and Raphael. No doubt they'll regret that they were unable to attend today because maybe we could have bumped up some of these albums. But yeah, on the whole, I'm generally happy.
All right. I'm glad you had a good time, Shelley. And if you're listening on Spotify, make sure to watch the episode on YouTube. I know you just listened to the whole episode, but at least take a look at the tier list to see how it evolved and what is placed where and all of that fun stuff. But thank you for listening. And again, that's Shelley from HateMeditations.com and Metallusion Magazine. He's currently doing his top 40 of 2023 on HateMeditations.com. Make sure to check that out. And thank you for listening. But